Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 258. This week the questions are taken from guides 314 and 315, that's the Satsuma class and the carrier conversion Shinano, the Wednesday videos on Typhoon Cobra and Admiral Cunningham's biography part 1, and a guest question from the Friday video on artifacts from the sunken U-boat U-534. So let's begin. BK Zhang asks, if the Japanese didn't run out of 12-inch guns and they built Satsuma as a dreadnought, what terminology would we use for all big gun battleships? I suspect it wouldn't have changed that much, and the main reason for that is that when things get named after the originator of the thing, it tends to be because that name is very, very catchy or very memorable for some reason, and doesn't leave you dissolving into occasional fits of giggles. And unfortunately, I think if Satsuma had been constructed as an all-big gun ship, you might have had Satsuma type going as the prevalent thing for a few years, but calling big, mean warships covered in guns Satsumas, I don't think would have stuck around for too long. Dreadnought has this kind of unique combination of being the first of our class historically and having a really, really, really cool name that pretty much translates universally. So I think either there would have just been a series of different definitions for the all-big gun battleship based on, you know, the local variation. So the Japanese would have called them Satsuma type, the British would have called them Dreadnought type, the Americans would have called them South Carolina type, etc. And then eventually one of them would have won out, most probably Dreadnought. Or the other alternative is a more generic form would have been adopted. Possibly big gun battleship, that's a little bit long, but then you have aircraft carrier, and aircraft carrier is actually a very good example because if you think about all the ships that were built that carried aircraft, Japanese, French, British, etc. in World War I, and then you think of the flight deck equipped vessels, so Furious in her final configuration, Hermes, Hosho, etc. You don't see aircraft carriers described as Furiouses, Hoshos, Hermes, Ark Royals, etc., etc. And I think that's because, you know, the names don't necessarily sound quite as cool as Dreadnought, and they don't necessarily relate to the ship's function quite as much as Dreadnought, because Dreadnought, that is what you would expect a big, heavily armored battleship to do. But Ark Royal doesn't have any specific tie to a vessel which carries and launches aircraft, and similar for all the other names. And likewise with destroyers, it's a derivation of torpedo boat destroyer. So, you know, there might have been a big gun battleship, an all gun battleship, or something along those lines, which will probably eventually be shortened down. So you might just end up with battleship or heavy battleship or something like that becoming the generic term for what we would now call a dreadnought. Bernard Rubin asks a related question. If the Satsumas were built as full-on dreadnoughts, would it change anything in the grand scheme of things? Broadly speaking, I don't think so, because they still would have gone by the wayside along with the Kawachis as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty. And semi-related, actually, in some ways to the previous question, it wouldn't actually have changed the overall balance of naval power all that much. But for one thing, Japan at the time was allied with Britain, and for another thing, although Satsuma was laid down before HMS Dreadnought, because of the speed that Fisher put on the construction of HMS Dreadnought, Dreadnought, whilst laid down almost half a year after Satsuma, went from laid down to launched to not commissioned but out on trials before Satsuma's hull had even launched. So Dreadnought would still have been the first all-big gun ship in service by a considerable margin, considering that Satsuma wouldn't be ready and commissioned for several more years after that. And because the two ships were laid down within the same year, say within about half a year of each other, the design details of the two are too close together temporally for Satsuma's design to have manifestly affected dreadnoughts. Now, if Satsuma had been laid down a year and a half before Dreadnought, whilst there was still time to alter Dreadnought's plans, then that might have changed things, because Fisher might have then looked at what he would have termed the latest developments in Japan, and, as Fisher would always do, try and one-up them. So if Satsuma had gone with her original plan of a twin 12-inch turret forward, one aft, or one twin on each wing and 4 singles, then Fisher, looking at the wing mountings, might, and I do stress might, have gone with one of his alternate Dreadnought designs, because if you remember from when we've talked about Dreadnought before, Dreadnought had the potential to be many different gun layouts, including one that is basically an Atlanta without the wing turrets, only with twin 12s instead of twin 5s, and some slightly saner ones in between. And given that historically she had an 8-gun broadside with 10 guns, it's possible that she would have ended up with an all-centerline armament, perhaps even a Dido style layout. That was something else Fisher looked at, 3 twins up front and 2 aft. Now, quite how you'd compensate for that in terms of stability on a hull like Dreadnought, I'm not entirely sure, but Fisher had obviously thought of something, and that would have given him his 6 guns firing ahead, 2 guns firing behind, but would also have given him a 10-gun broadside, which is actually better than Dreadnought's design as launched. But of course, as I said, with the aforementioned stability issues and probably some issues in terms of where exactly you put the machinery, because more of the centerline space is occupied linearly. So potentially Dreadnought might end up looking like a very, very different vessel if Satsuma had been laid down considerably beforehand, but she wasn't. So yeah, overall, she would have been an interesting... Well, it probably would have been an interesting point of argument, because with Dreadnought entering service first, everything would probably end up still being called Dreadnoughts, but you'd get a lot of pedantic argumentation online these days as to what exactly is the first Dreadnought, Satsuma or Dreadnought, and the argument obviously ranging from, well, Satsuma was laid down first, to other people saying, yes, but Dreadnought entered service first or was launched first, or things like that. Because, let's face it, there's arguments like that online already about other things. Oyoyo asks, considering their location very close to the port and starboard sides of the hull, was the protection of wing-mounted primary turrets lower than those located on the centerline of Dreadnought-type battleships? Now, that's a very good question, and the answer is that it depends. I know that doesn't sound very helpful. You can see here with a wing-mounted turret that there is a line of scuttles, which is normal, above the main armour belt, but then you can see armour is built up directly in front of the turret. Now, the reason I say it depends is because the variance can be on where exactly the wing turret is mounted, because for the protection of the turret, the barbette, and the upper part of the magazines, obviously you have the gun house on top, which everyone can see, and then you have the barbette, which is a cylinder, usually, of armour. And that armour may be continuous thickness, it may vary in thickness, because of course the barbette comes all the way up to the whichever deck the turret is mounted on. The main belt usually does not come up that far, so you'll see on some ships you will have a very thick barbette that runs from the turret itself down either to the level or just below the level of the belt armour before it starts to thin down, because the logic of that is, well, if the upper portion of the ship is either little armoured or unarmoured, a shell could fly in, and then the barbette therefore needs to be quite thick to stop the shell. Whereas if the shell comes in lower down, it will hit the belt armour, and thus, in theory, the barbette behind it only needs to stop fragments or a very much slowed down shell if a shell manages to penetrate, at which point it can afford to be thinner. Now, not everyone agrees with that logic, so sometimes the barbettes, as I said, and also sometimes for just simplicity, are a single continuous thickness all the way down to the magazines, which in my opinion, as long as you make it a reasonable thickness, is probably actually a better and safer solution. But that's by the by. Now, where that plays into our ships here is that if the wing turret is wing-mounted, but set back somewhat from the very edge by a reasonable amount, could be 5-6 feet, something like that, then the barbette will obviously be thick at the top, same as it would be on a centerline mount, and it has the space to go down behind the armor belt, so you still have the armor belt protection and the barbette protection. Alternatively, the turret could be much, much closer, basically flush with the hull on the outer edge of its curve, at which point the barbette will blend into the main armor belt, which usually means, although it's a relatively rare occurrence, it usually means that the barbette essentially ceases when it interacts with the main belt, at which point the protection is less because it's just the protection of the main armor belt. And then finally, you have options which don't really tend to appear on dreadnought battleships, but you do see appear on some pre-dreadnought battleships and occasionally on armoured cruiser designs, if not necessarily in the implementation all the time, where you might have a barbette that, because of the way the hull slopes, actually protrudes out from the hull, at which point the barbette is the only protection that the ammunition passages for the turret have, at which point it has significantly less protection than if it was behind the hull and behind the main armour in the relevant areas. And of course, even in your best case scenario, where the turret is set far back enough that you have both the barbette and the main belt protection the same way you would have on a centerline mount, it is still going to be marginally less protective, simply because of the distances involved. So if you have a turret on the centerline and a shell, let's say, comes in through the side or comes in through the main belt, whichever way, it's just a proportional amount of how much is it going to be slowed down or possibly stopped. But let's say in either case it gets through, that shell in theory will have its fuse initiated by smashing through the side of the ship and will be slowed down by some amount. Obviously less if it's gone through the upper part of the hull and more if it's gone through the belt. And that means that with the distance involved, the shell might, depending on how much it's been slowed, detonate part way to the barbette, at which point the barbette just has to deal with blast and fragments rather than a direct impact from the main body of the shell. It might also mean that the shell will tumble and disintegrate, which is easier to resist because of the distances involved. Or you might end up with the shell surviving and still impacting the barbette, but it will have slowed down, not just from passing through the outer section of the hull, whatever that level of armor happens to be, but it will also have gone through probably bulkheads and decks and so on and so forth, which all will marginally reduce the speed and capability of the shell in question. Whereas if the barbette is 4 or 5 foot behind the main armor belt and the hull, most of those things don't apply. There's not going to be much, if anything, intervening between penetrating one and penetrating the other. The barbette may actually be impacted by portions of the armor belt itself if the armor belt is penetrated or there's significant spooling going on. There won't be anywhere near as much time for the shell to begin tumbling, so it's more likely to maintain something vaguely resembling a full pointy nose forward orientation. And of course, if the shell's been slowed down and the fuse is going to detonate, then with that much shorter distance, the fuse is probably still running when it starts to penetrate the barbette armor. So even in a best case scenario for wing turrets, the protection, assuming the thicknesses remain the same, of course you could up the thickness, but assuming it remains the same, a wing mount will always be at least marginally less well protected than a centerline mount from a direct hit. SS2203 asks, if she was completed in time, what role would the Shinano have served, and would she have even made an impact? In either case that I'm about to discuss, her overall impact probably wouldn't be too much, but you do have to think about what the role she would have served in would have been, because you've got the role she was designed to serve, And then you've got, by the time that she would have been in service, had Archfish not sunk her, what role she probably would have ended up serving. So if she had been completed, let's say Archfish either misses her or doesn't quite sink her and she gets repaired and she gets back put into service, you can essentially look at the fate of the completed Unryu class carriers. So she wouldn't actually have ended up being used as an aircraft carrier by that stage because, frankly, Japan was out of skilled carrier pilots for the most part, and she would have been a very, very lonely figure compared to the masses and masses and masses of carriers that the US and even the British were bringing to bear against Japan, at which point she almost certainly would have been used as an aircraft transport, again, similar to the Unryus, taking normal aircraft as well as Oka kamikaze rocket aircraft and so forth to frontline positions. So effectively acting as a glorified aircraft transport. Yes, that probably would have gotten a few dozen more Japanese aircraft to the front lines than historically, but the overall impact of that is going to be pretty minimal, especially considering she'll probably end up getting intercepted and sunk by a US submarine later on anyway. And the only way that that really makes any kind of spectacular difference to the Pacific War is if it just so happens that she just manages to deliver a bunch of Okas to the right place at the right time, and somehow that particular swarm is just enough to launch them, I don't know, maybe V1 style off a rail or something, and you manage to get one or more Oka hits that historically didn't occur on something really big like a battleship or a carrier, potentially causing a major sinking loss event for the US Navy, which would be annoying. So that could be classified as an impact of sorts, but it wouldn't change things in terms of the overall outcome of the war. It would just be a rather tragic footnote towards the end of it. Then the other scenario is, the role that she was intended to serve as, i.e. a heavily armoured, essentially backstop HMS Unicorn style support carrier. She can't serve that by the time she would have been commissioned because there's no Japanese Kirubutai for her to support and supply. If you wound the clock back a little bit to maybe before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, aka the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, so there actually was a Japanese carrier force for her to supply. Again, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference because essentially, she's a giant aircraft transport with a limited degree of a self-escorting capability with a few squadrons of fighters to provide a combat air patrol. But the fundamental problem the Japanese had by Philippine Sea isn't so much the aircraft being shot out of the sky, although that does happen in very large numbers. It's also the fact that the ships themselves, the carriers, aren't surviving very long. So, if you've got spare aircraft to restock the carrier's air wings after some devastating losses of the day, well, that's great. But if the carriers themselves have also been lost or heavily damaged, there's no point in having a bunch of spare aircraft for them because they have no platform to launch from. So either way, if Shinano had been completed, whatever role they tried to put her in, she's not going to have a particularly massive impact on the war. Realistically, the only time period when she can have an impact on the war is early in the war in 1942, if she'd somehow magically been completed in her conversion role at that point, because at that stage, well, just having an extra hull around, regardless of its particular use, and perhaps in things like Guadalcanal being able to resupply aircraft quite significantly, that might have been somewhat helpful and might have come about at a time when that intervention might have actually had a significant change on the timeline. It's not going to affect the overall outcome, but it might have delayed things a fair bit. BK Zhong asks, worst carrier competition, Bearn, Graf Zeppelin, Shinano and Aquila. Who wins in terms of being the least bad design, and who is the worst to design, assuming the latter three ships had somehow been completed and with pilots? Worst is almost certainly going to fall to Bearn, but that's not really a huge surprise because Bearn is a not particularly good conversion that's 2 decades or more older than the other three in the competition, so of course she's going to be worse. She's far, far slower and, generally speaking, far less capable. Although, given the limitations in the speed of launch and how many aircraft she could actually launch before everything needed to be reset and recharged, Graf Zeppelin is not really that much better, maybe even competing with Bearn in terms of a pure ability to carry and operate aircraft role. Graf Zeppelin has a few other things to recommend it above and beyond Bearn: heavier armament, faster, etc. But yeah, Graf Zeppelin's ability to actually launch aircraft quickly and in large numbers, yeah, she ain't winning this one. Which leaves you with Shinano and Aquila. Now, I've already enumerated some of the shortcomings of Shinano already. I think Shinano does, on the other hand, have a little bit of a clawback because of her sheer size. Even with her primary designed use as a transport and support carrier, she still has a reasonable-ish, for a conversion, air group, even if it's hilariously inefficient for her actual size, as said. And she does have the capability of potentially being built as a full aircraft carrier with considerably larger air group and obviously massive survivability, unless she's half finished and gets torpedoed repeatedly, of course. So Shinano has the capability to potentially win, but in terms of a return on investment per ton, assuming they'd all been completed, I think Aquila actually is probably the least bad, because she's got the speed. Okay, Graf Zeppelin, Shinano, Aquila, they've all got acceptable speeds for an aircraft carrier. Bearn is left behind in that. Protection-wise, her designed anti-aircraft battery is not too shabby, which puts her on a par with or above all the other entries, pretty much. Graf Zeppelin's hilarious capability of acting as a surface commerce raider is not really relevant to being an aircraft carrier, even if it is a sort of a wildcard factor. And then in terms of air group, as designed, obviously this is specifically referencing Shinano, as designed, she has one of the larger air groups. And as I mentioned in the video on Aquila, she also has a rather fetching idea of using modified fighters as her strike aircraft as well, which means that, assuming that that setup actually works, the strike aircraft are going to be somewhat more capable than some of the other strike aircraft planned to be fitted on the various other carriers in question. And of course, once those strike aircraft have jettisoned their loads, dropped their torpedoes on attackers and so forth, they are far, far more capable of defending themselves than the average Stuka or Val or Kate or whatever. So, yeah, overall, I think Aquila's probably walking away with this one. Scott Mason asks, I was reading David Ross's book on the world's greatest battleships from the 16th century to the Gulf War, and I read that the Henri Grâce à Dieu was renamed Edward Grâce à Dieu after the death of Henry VIII, which confused me because I thought that it was considered extreme bad luck to rename a ship. I know Deutschland was renamed Lutzow, so I know some ships did get renamed, so I was wondering just how often would ships of the time get new names, and also when did the superstition about renaming ships being bad luck start to be a thing? The idea that it's extremely bad luck to rename your ship goes back to absolutely ancient times. You come across it even in the Greco-Roman era. But when it comes to renaming Henri Grâce à Dieu after Edward, and a few other renamings of that kind of period, what you're actually looking at is competition between superstitions. So, on the one hand, you have Henri Grâce à Dieu. Yes, it's considered bad luck at the time to rename a ship. On the other hand, the ship was named for the monarch is now dead, and it was also considered bad luck to have a ship named after a monarch when that monarch was no longer with you, assuming it was relatively proximate. Naming after historical figures was fine, but the biggest and best ship in the realm was always supposed to be named after the reigning monarch, and if that changed, then you rename the ship. And you actually saw this a number of times. The Elizabeth Jonas, a couple of rulers down the line, when Elizabeth I came to the throne, was originally supposed to be named after her sister Mary. The name was changed on the stocks. So in those cases, it was simply that they thought the prospective bad luck and ill fortune that would attend them from basically going around with a dead man or dead woman's ship was more than would be attended by renaming the ship completely. Another renaming superstition that tended to overcome the general prohibition on renaming ships, especially again around the Tudor and Stuart times, was the fact that a lot of ships would carry their owner's name as part of it. So the Ark Raleigh, for instance, was built by Sir Walter Raleigh. But if the ship was transferred to a different owner, it was held, at least according to some sources, not necessarily, although there's a bit of disagreement on this, but according to some sources, it was held that owning a ship that carried another person's name would bring you bad luck, because that ship would always want to return to its original owner and do its original owner's bidding, which wasn't you, which was quite bad. So hence Ark Raleigh was renamed to Ark Royal, because it was now in the Royal Fleet Service, and Ark Elizabeth sounded just a bit silly. And you see this with various other ships that carry their owners' names as well. So there are a few superstitions that override the superstition against renaming a ship generally. Of course, when it comes to Deutschland being renamed Lutzow, that's just, you don't want a ship carrying your country's name to be sunk in action, but not really much more than that. Leo Junk asks, could you point me to a video, or perhaps make one, where you cover the Salvo system of German battleships? The British usually seem to use half salvos. Bismarck used pairs of turrets, all the front guns and then all the rear guns. What did World War I Germans do? Unfortunately, when it comes to exactly what system of half salvo you use, it varies even within a specific navy, simply because, especially in World War I, the turret layout of ships varies constantly. So if you think about, just for the High Seas Fleet, the Nassaus and Helgolands, for example, they only have a single fore turret and a single aft turret, and the other 4 turrets are mounted on the wings. So do you use the fore turret and the forwardmost of whichever of the 2 wing turrets you've got? Or do you maybe use the fore and aft turrets followed by the 2 wing turrets? And, you know, there's arguments for both, because if you've got the forwardmost turret, well, the forwardmost wing turret in the relevant direction is going to be closest to the foremost turret, but it's also going to be offset. Whereas if you use the 2 wing turrets together, or the 2 centerline turrets together, then you're going to have them all on the same alignment, even if they are, in the case of the fore and aft turrets, perhaps slightly further apart. Then you get to ships like the Kaiser class, you can see here, which also have wing turrets, but now there's an uneven number of wing turrets. You can do a pair of after turrets salvo firing, but there's still only 1 fore turret. So if you're going to do a half salvo with the fore turret, you still have to use a wing turret, but the wing turret, depending on which side you're on, may be closer or further away. You don't really have the option, except on extreme perpendicular angles, to do a wing turret only salvo. And then, of course, as you move on, you get all centerline armaments. You've got a midships turret. Do you use that with a 6-gun salvo, or do you just use, now you can use 2 fore or 2 aft turrets? And then, of course, eventually, although they never saw combat, Bearn and Baden can use 2 fore turrets and 2 aft turrets, pretty much like Bismarck did in World War II. And that's before you get into captain's personal preference, because, as we mentioned, you could have a number of different options going on some battleship layouts. And whilst there were preferred ways of doing it, both in the High Seas Fleet and in other navies, it wasn't strictly required that you stuck to it. You could run something slightly different. So if you take a ship that even is a very simple one with 4 turrets, 2 forward superfiring, 2 aft superfiring, then you could do the 2 forward and the 2 aft. You could do the forwardmost and aftmost. You could do the 2 superfiring turrets. You could do the 1st and 3rd turret, and then the 2nd and 4th turret, and so on and so forth. But the point of firing half salvos is, as I've mentioned previously, to be able to throw shells downrange in a useful enough grouping, which then will allow you to go, okay, minimum ideally 4 data points, then we need to adjust our aim accordingly, and you continue as you go. The problem, of course, being that once you have established the range, you want to hit the enemy with as many shells as possible, and that's when you switch over to full salvo firing. At least so goes the theory. And this is actually a little bit of a problem when you see ships introduced with triple turrets, because especially if you get to what some people call the classic battleship layout, i.e. the one that you see quite a lot in World War II with 2 triples forward and 1 aft, 6 shells from your 2 forward turrets, I mean, yeah, it'll give you good data, but then that leaves you with your other half salvos 3 shells from the aft turret, and 3 is just a little bit too few for really good data. And then, of course, you flip that on its head again, and if you start firing guns from individual turrets across the ship, which you could do, then that gives you a more accurate idea of what your entire ship is doing, all the turrets are doing, but even then you can have slight complexities, because if you have a 3 triple turret ship, you fire 1 gun from each, well, that's 3 shells. It's not particularly good data, so which turret do you choose to fire the 4th shell from? And then you've got a 5 shell second half salvo. And obviously, referencing back to our 4 twin turret design, you could fire 1 gun from each turret and then the other gun from each turret. There's all sorts of combinations, and you do see a reasonable amount of variation. I think if you want to know exactly what Koenig is doing at Moon Sound, the best way is probably not to look for what did the German High Seas Fleet program say you should do, but rather maybe to look for the battle logs or the deck logs for Koenig, probably in the Bundesarchive, and see what it records as, what were they actually doing, because they will record which turrets are firing at which points. Chimarasite asks, when you said in the Typhoon Cobra video that ammunition on destroyers was being carried down into the magazines, does that mean ready-use ammunition was being removed from the lockers to move that weight deeper into the ship? Yes, basically any ammunition that was not in the magazines was being taken down into the magazines. And as Chimarasite goes on to ask in the question, is that a measure of how unlikely an encounter with the enemy was, that they were eliminating the possibility of immediate reply to attack? Yeah, pretty much. I mean, for one thing, the chances of a Japanese submarine or aircraft showing up in the middle of a typhoon are slim to none, and even if they did, they'd be far more worried about their own survival than taking a shot. And if they were, I suppose it's the Japanese, they could be mad enough to try, they are never ever going to hit, because they're going to be being chucked around and you're being chucked around, so any firing solution you come up with is complete and utter garbage. So yeah, you don't need to worry about being attacked when you're also in the middle of a typhoon in World War II. The other thing is, it's not just about moving the weight further down in the ship, although it might help a little bit with the ship's stability. The other thing is, as you can see here, you would have a lot of violent movement from the ship pitching and rolling and so forth, plus obviously the seas smashing all around. And the absolute last thing that you want, if you are potentially having to go out on deck or anywhere really on the ship to try and fix something or to get from point A to point B, is a bunch of potentially live ammunition, or ammunition period, rolling around or being chucked around freely, because that stuff weighs a fair bit. And if you're having to make a run for it to tie something down, tell someone to get inside, or just get to report to someone because something's broken, if you get hit by sea spray, that's bad enough. If you get hit by sea spray that's also chucking a 5-inch shell at you, you could end up with a lot of broken bones, and that could very well be the end of you. Not to, and that's not even to say what would happen if, forgetting whether or not the shells would explode, they almost certainly wouldn't. But, if the shell just gets chucked into the ship, if the ready-use locker gets broken open by the sea, that shell just being physically thrown by the sea hard enough might break things that otherwise wouldn't be broken. So it's as much, if not more, about reducing the amount of potential heavy objects being thrown about up top in the ship as it is getting a bit more weight down in the keel area. UNSC Forward Onto Dawn asks, suppose in 1939-40 the British decided to keep on building at least one Lion-class battleship rather than build HMS Vanguard. Could they have gotten HMS Lion into service before the end of the war? Oh, absolutely they could have. Bearing in mind that Vanguard was laid down a reasonable bit over 2 years after Lion and Temeraire. Now, granted, Lion and Temeraire's construction in mid to late 1939 wasn't exactly proceeding at the highest of paces, but Vanguard, which was laid down in October 1941, was stop, start through most of her construction. Although at some points she was given priority and at other points she was derated. And with all of that, Vanguard was still launched in November 1944 and commissioned in May 1946. So she was not quite a year late for entering the war. I mean, she still would have had to work up and everything. But even assuming you had the stop, start nature of Vanguard, dial that back by 2 years and 3 months, and you go from commissioning in May 1946, dialing it back by 3 months gives you February 46, which then go back 2 years gives you February 44, which means that a theoretical Lion proceeding on the same scale as Vanguard wouldn't be really doing much of anything in the European theatre. She'd be commissioning and operational a little bit too late for D-Day. I mean, you might just about, I suppose, get her in on shore bombardment duty on D-Day, but she would probably then be a flagship out in the Pacific with the British Pacific Fleet for the rest of the war. Now, of course, I say that is assuming that you've got the same building program as you have with Vanguard, given that if they decide, actually, no, we are going to get this thing completed and it's the early part of the war, there's slightly less demands going 6 ways from Sunday as it was during the bulk of the war when Vanguard was being built. So you might even see a Lion being completed in mid-43, which is actually what they reckoned with the delays to the 16-inch guns was going to happen anyway. So Lion and Temeraire could have been commissioned in mid to late 43. Potentially, even if they worked up quickly enough, you could have had Lion instead of Duke of York predating on Scharnhorst at the Battle of North Cape. And then one or both of them definitely would have been around, because by the end of 43, the Mediterranean's not so much of a priority for fast battleships. You almost certainly would have seen them at D-Day and then out in the Pacific Fleet. BK Zhang asks, in most discussions of the Battle of Samar, it's claimed without Taffy-3, Center Force would have destroyed the American transports, and this would have resulted in the loss of large numbers of American troops and or supplies. However, considering that the Philippine landing started on October the 20th, while the Battle of Samar was on the 25th, and based on primary American records from the landing forces, it would appear the majority of not only the troops, but also most of the supplies had already been unloaded by the time the engagement took place. With Task Force 38 about to make its way south in a matter of hours, preventing Kurita from staying around long enough to attack any further reinforcement or resupply vessels, is there a strong argument for Operation Shogo never actually having had chance of success, simply due to poor timing, even if Taffy-3 had put no resistance up whatsoever? I don't think so, for a number of reasons. Firstly, whilst yes, a large number of men and supplies had been landed, there were still quite a lot of men, quite a lot of equipment, and quite a lot of supplies still on various ships floating around. And if you just look at the progress reports in some of the more detailed books about the land campaign, and you have entire units still landing on the 24th, the 25th, and thereafter. The first wave and its supplies are pretty much ashore, but there's reinforcements and second wave and third wave landings all going on. Plus, as you can see from this photo, which is taken on the beaches of Leyte in late October 1944, just because supplies are landed doesn't mean they've gone particularly far. They're first landed into little depots on the beach, which you can see there, and then moved slightly further inland. But by the 25th, although the US troops had made fairly good progress, their beachheads are still beachheads. They haven't got massively far inland, certainly not far enough to establish massive supply dumps well off the beach that are completely secure and, as invulnerable as anything can be from naval bombardment. And equally, the troops themselves, what the defenses they have built, if any, will be facing the Japanese troops in the interior. And again, beachheads, they haven't gone massively far inland. They've gone several miles, but we're not talking significantly beyond either the spotting or bombardment range of ships offshore. Indeed, there were still ships, US Navy ships, offering fire support at this point to US troops. So if the Centre Force had reached the area, then yes, the transports and the supply ships would have been slightly less loaded than they would have been a few days earlier, but there still would have been quite a number of casualties sustained in the sinking of those vessels. Plus, there would have been a large number of visible supply dumps which could have been destroyed, and pretty much any US troops that were visible from using the optical spotting systems on the Japanese ships offshore would have been in for a shore bombardment by the Japanese that the US troops couldn't really do much about, which would have caused further casualties. And that's without the disruptive effects of, what casualties are inflicted on US troops by the fact some of their supplies have been destroyed, by the fact they're not getting reinforcements, by the fact that Japanese troops might counterattack whilst they are trying to reorganize following the loss of those supplies and, being shelled, and so on and so forth. Plus, even if Lee's battleships are on their way south, which they are, Kurita doesn't know that. So he doesn't have a particular reason unless he launches a scout aircraft and they happen to spot Lee coming in from the north. And to be honest, his scout aircraft, if anything, are probably going to be flying over the land, trying to spot more targets for Kurita's fleet's guns. But if Kurita thinks he's broken through the American carrier forces and destroyed them, which remember he did think tthe was basically most of the American carrier forces, then he has no particular reason to withdraw in a few hours. Now that does mean he's going to get caught between Lee's battleships and the shore and probably horribly crushed, but it also means he's going to have several hours of essentially a free fire zone if the Taffys don't put up any resistance, and he's probably going to expend a good chunk of his fleet's ammo doing an awful lot of damage, which can then be further compounded by Japanese counterattacks taking advantage of it. So, yeah, it's not necessarily going to stop the landings. It's not going to necessarily allow the Japanese to push the Americans off of Leyte, but it certainly is going to have a fairly significant impact on what's going on. Ma Hawkman asks, are there any World War II U-boats that are still available to be looked at as museum pieces? Yes, until the reopening of U-534, there are 3 other U-boats which are available to the public to visit. One is in the US. If you can survive Chicago, you can go and see U-505 in the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. She's a Type 9C, so a slightly earlier variant than 534. Then in Germany, there are 2 others. There is U-995, which is a relatively late model Type 7, which is the classic German U-boat of World War II. That's in Kiel, so you can go and have a look there. And then there is also U-2540, which is a Type 21, an electroboat, which is only really just about technically a World War II submarine. She was then salvaged and restored, and she can be seen in Bremerhaven in Germany. ACC asks, a common trope in fiction and science fiction, like every other Star Trek movie, is a ship that's on its shakedown cruise when trouble breaks out, and the story of it being forced into combat while understaffed, underarmed, and just not ready for primetime action. Are you aware of any real-life accounts of a ship on its shakedown cruise or on a show the flag cruise being pulled into an outbreak of hostilities without time to return to port and fully gear up? And did that ship save the galaxy? Generally speaking, no, simply because a shakedown cruise, which is usually done just after the ship's commissioned, just after its acceptance trials, is as much to find out what will break long-term in use as compared to the acceptance trials, which tend to be very targeted over the course of a day or two for each trial, and also to get the crew familiar with the ship. So whilst the ship on a shakedown cruise is typically fully kitted out and fully crewed, the crew, broadly speaking, won't really know how to operate the ship. Now, of course, if the crew has transferred from another ship of the same class and they're going into action, or a very similar vessel, then obviously they're going to be much more familiar with how to operate the ship, generally speaking, than if it's the first ship of a class or if it's a brand new crew who's never been on a ship of this type before. But even if, say, the crew from a damaged Essex class that needs, a 6-8 month overhaul has been pulled in and just stuck on a brand new Essex class, there's still going to be lots of minor details on the ship that they're not used to, because every ship is slightly different. And so sending a ship that's on a shakedown cruise into action is a terrible idea, because it's just going to perform a lot worse. Now, that isn't to say that there are slight modifications that did happen. So back in the Age of Sail, ships that were on shakedown cruises with new crews very well might end up in action, but that's because in the Age of Sail, where exactly the front line was something of a mutable concept, especially considering a lot of the Age of Sail battles involved things like England versus Spain or England versus France, where the front lines between the two nations' borders could be, at least at sea, a few dozen miles apart when you get to something like the Dover Straits or the English Channel generally, at which point, just because you're on a shakedown cruise from, say, the Medway round to Portsmouth doesn't mean you won't encounter French warships near the Dover Straits, for example. But in the Age of Steam and Steel, it's very, very, very much rarer. Additionally, another variation on this theme is that ships in wartime especially quite often had very abbreviated shakedown cruises. So almost all warships at the time could have such things. USS Massachusetts is a good example. Sometimes it said her shakedown cruise was Operation Torch. That's not strictly true. She commissioned and went on a short shakedown cruise, and as I said, like many World War II commissioned ships, a very shortened shakedown cruise, after which she was immediately deployed to Operation Torch. So if you look at the total length of time a peace-down shakedown cruise and then fixing, refitting and rechecking cruise would take place, yes, USS Massachusetts was fighting the Battle of Casablanca around about the time she should be 2/3 to 80% of the way through her shakedown cruise in peacetime, but she had an official separate shortened shakedown cruise before she went out. USS Princeton, which you can see in this picture, is another example. Although this was in the 1950s when the Korean War broke out, she was sent into action with an extremely abbreviated shakedown cruise going on. Flag cruises are a slightly different scenario. I guess in some ways you could say Goeben is an example of that, because she was pretty much in the Mediterranean to show the flag and look all important and everything, whereas the High Seas Fleet would much rather have had her back in first scouting group when war broke out and she was forced to make a run for the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, most of the large-scale overseas deployments of the German Navy, I mean, Goeben's probably the best example, but others could probably be sort of considered this, because whilst Admiral von Spee's East Asia Squadron was great in peacetime, again, whilst you obviously got the Battle of Coronel out of it and the cruise of the Emden, if you asked the German High Seas Fleet High Command in 1914, would you rather have Admiral von Spee causing minor disturbances on the other side of the planet, or would you rather have the entire East Asian Squadron back as part of the fleet screen for the High Seas Fleet? I can guarantee you they would have said the latter. But an example of ships being essentially called into action whilst understaffed and not technically ready for full-scale action, you could actually look at quite a lot of ships that ended up caught up in the Korean War. HMS Belfast being just one example, but one I've done a lot of research on recently, and so serves as a case in point. She was stationed in the Far East by the Royal Navy, but she was operating with a peacetime crew. And then when hostilities broke out in Korea so quickly, there wasn't the time to either fly additional crew out or even pull additional crew from other ships, because every ship was needed. And so with her peacetime level of crew, which was lower than a full wartime complement, she headed out and she actually did her first tour off of Korea entirely with the low numbers of a peacetime crew. She then popped back to the UK, refitted, got a wartime crew, full complement, and went back out to fight. But there's a number of warships off the Korean coast during that first few months / year of the Korean War which are all in the same boat. Christian B asks, how did navies fit so many more people on ships than originally intended? For example, the World War II cruiser Leipzig went from 26 officers and 508 men to 24 officers but 826 men during the war. It's a combination of measures. Most warships are designed with a little bit of overflow capacity, partly because people accept there might be new systems installed on ships that might need more crew. There might be temporary needs for more crew, especially ships that are designated as flagships. But even for cruisers and things, if you go out on a long-range mission, you might need additional prize crew, special circumstances, transport, etc. So there's always a small amount of overhead in how crew allocations are put together. But once you exceed that, then things start to get rather more interesting. There are a variety of routes that a ship can take to increase accommodation. Sometimes areas of the ship are repurposed. For example, the hangars on quite a number of World War II warships, as radar began to take over and aircraft were taken off, were converted to a variety of uses. Some of them included additional accommodation. Additionally, during refits, lightweight superstructure could be built up on the upper decks of the ship to incorporate both new equipment and additional accommodation for the men who had to, operate that new equipment. This is quite a frequent thing when you look into sort of the mid-sized and up refits of various warships during the Second World War, for example. Sometimes existing crew spaces would just be made to hold more men, so additional hammock hooks could be provided. If you have, say, double bunks, well, guess what? Now some of you have triple bunks, and yeah, that may involve a little bit less headroom, but, sucks to be you, but we need the additional space. Additionally, the spacing between various accommodation units could be reduced. So if there used to be, say, 4 foot arbitrarily between bunks, well, if we move all the bunks so they're 3 foot apart, that might mean we can fit in an extra couple of bunk sets at the end of the row. Then you start to move out of the designated crew quarters, and guess what? Now there's bunks bolted to the side of the corridors, or there's hammocks being hung in the corridors and then stowed away during daytime hours. And one or more of these measures, perhaps in combination, will usually allow a significant increase in the number of men aboard. Of course, you then have to figure out how you're going to feed the additional men, which is a whole other thing for the kitchens, but that's a separate matter. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, was there ever a sort of frankinship, a warship made up of various different parts from scrapped or destroyed ships? There are a number of different examples at differing levels of severity. For example, we know USS Wisconsin, when she was involved in an unfortunate nose-bending incident, ended up having a section of her bow replaced with the bow of her incomplete sister ship, Kentucky. So technically, Wisconsin is part Kentucky, even though it's a relatively small part overall. It's still a fairly important one. Then, of course, we have the ship that you can see here. This is the World War I destroyer HMS Zubian, probably one of the most famous examples, where you had 2 tribal-class destroyers, World War I tribal class, that is, HMS Nubian and HMS Zulu. And, Nubian had her bow blown off by a German torpedo boat, and Zulu had a mine blow her stern off, at which point the Admiralty went, well, why don't we just trim the broken bits and stick the 2 bits together, and hey, at least we get one destroyer out of 2 lost ones, and hence HMS Zubian was born. She survived the rest of World War I. On a smaller scale, you could say the various ships that were kept in service by basically cannibalizing one or more of their sister ships that was held in reserve basically as a floating spare parts store, while the fleet in question was being run down somewhat, possibly count as frankenships. For example, the previous to last HMS Ark Royal, the Audacious class, Ark Royal in the Royal Navy was kept running largely by stealing bits from the hulk of HMS Eagle for a good long while. And I mean, technically, ships like most of the Royal Navy's monitors and HMS Vanguard could be considered sort of frankenships, because the monitors were usually freshly built custom hulls, albeit not all the time. Sometimes they were repurposed, like some taken over Norwegian coastal defence ships. But almost all of the Royal Navy Monitor's gun armament was taken from a variety of scrapped or damaged vessels, and of course HMS Vanguard used the repurposed 15-inch gun turrets from HMS Courageous and HMS Glorious. Smokey the Bear asks, some nations' destroyers have some stripes on their stacks. Some may be a bad idea, as only a glimpse of the stripes through the mist or smoke of those at an angle still tells you what direction the bow is. What do these stripes represent? It depends on the era, and it depends on the navy. Essentially, funnel bands of some description you can see here on the destroyers in question in this photograph. There's a black band on D126 up here up front. They're all forms of identification in some manner. So at some points, for example, in the Royal Navy, a flotilla leader would have a black band on their foremost funnel, or in the case of this, the only visible funnel. At other times, also in the Royal Navy, there would be multiple bands, and they would represent which flotilla the destroyer was attached to. So, taking just obviously not necessarily strictly speaking a historical example, but you could have one band on one funnel, and that would be, right, this destroyer is in the first flotilla, two bands on that funnel, this destroyer is in the second flotilla, or you could have one band on the fore funnel and another band on the second funnel if all your destroyers had at least two funnels, and so on and so forth. Whereas with the Japanese, for example, they ran a system whereby the funnel bands indicated what position within the flotilla the ship was. So one band was the flotilla flagship, two bands was the second ship in the flotilla, and so on and so forth. And it wasn't just restricted to destroyers. Cruisers had them, even battleships had them at various points. There's plenty of pre-dreadnoughts out there that you can find photos of with various bands, also in different colours at the same time, on their funnels, which are all various codified means of identifying which particular ship that particular vessel is. However, as you point out, there are a number of issues with having this form of ID, because it's a very easy way to tell what the ship is. That's its point in peacetime, and so you do not want an easy way for the enemy to tell what ship that is in wartime, and so in wartime these all tend to get painted out very quickly. Chloe Delaney Sinclair asks, was depleted uranium ever a thing for battleship shells? No, because, well, depleted uranium wasn't even a thing for the vast majority of the battleship era, only really overlapping with the very last battleships in service in World War II and shortly thereafter. And at the time, depleted uranium was a waste product of the newly discovered enriched uranium process, which was mostly at that point used for making things that went boom in a very big way. Depleted uranium, at least as far as I can tell, I mean, it's post-1950, so take this with a pinch of salt, but as far as I can tell, depleted uranium wasn't even really considered as an ammunition type until the 70s, maybe the 80s. At which point there was only one set of battleships in service, and they, as far as I know, were not manufacturing any new shells for them, that being the Iowas, at which point there's essentially zero chance of a depleted uranium battleship shell. The Rogue Chief asks, in one of the Fisher videos it was mentioned that the new wireless communication technology in effect allowed London to function as a global command and control centre. Might this context partially excuse some of the micromanaging the Admiralty tended to do in the early months of World War I, if they were operating under the understanding that this was just the new capability of warfare? In my opinion, not really, because the tendency of Admiralties to try and micromanage their navies goes back way before World War I, and it has pretty much universally always ended in complete and utter disaster. Philip II of Spain tried to micromanage the Armada, despite the fact that the Armada and him, well, at least once the Armada got to the English Channel, were literally weeks away from each other in terms of reciprocal contact. So given that the entire campaign from the Armada entering the Channel to what they were hoping would be a successful landing on the English coast would take place within the scope of time it would take for one letter from Medina Sidonia to reach Madrid and then get back again, quite where Philip thought he was going to be micromanaging the fleet, I don't know. But this kind of continues every time there is an advance in communications technology, whether it's something as simple as, faster picket ships being able to take messages out to commanders in the field in weeks rather than months, or semaphore allowing signals to be transmitted from London to Portsmouth and then put onto picket ships or messenger packets in hours instead of a day or two to ride down there. Or the invention of widespread steam power, allowing ships to more reliably traverse certain distances instead of it being a moving target of possibly a few days, possibly several weeks. Or ships deploying telegraph cables, meaning that now ships overseas in far distant stations can receive orders when they happen to put into port, or at the time of World War I, radio stations allowing telegraph signals to be sent to ports and then being broadcast out to ships at a given distance from that port, although it wasn't a global spanning radio network at that stage in the true sense of the word. Every single time one of these things comes in, central admiralties and central governments keep trying to micromanage shipping, and there's a reason we have the term backseat driver. Even if someone is sitting in another seat within the same automobile as you, if you've ever been the driver, you will be perfectly aware that they are capable of giving all sorts of annoying hints and tips and advice based on what they can see of the situation. But you, as the driver, with all the various wing mirrors and these days cameras and other sensors around you, actually normally have a much better situational awareness of what's going on around you as the driver than the person who may be 3 feet away from you knows. Now compound that to tens, hundreds, or even thousands of miles, and the time lag inherent, and there's no way on the planet any admiralty has any business trying to micromanage the conduct of its ships at any significant distance. Sure, they can pass on intelligence, they can pass on general orders, they can pass on information about the political goings-on in the world, but they should always give the admiral or captain on scene the freedom of operation to do as they see fit within the context of those orders, because they're the ones who have the best idea of what's actually going on there. Even signals that are 5 to 10 minutes old can be completely irrelevant in the face of events that have just happened in those past 5 to 10 minutes. And it's not like it stopped in World War I either. The Admiralty and the government in 1982 kept trying to micromanage the Falklands War, which probably cost the Royal Navy 2 or 3 ships it otherwise wouldn't have lost if, the government had just shut up and let the captains and Admiral Woodward get on with what they were supposed to be doing. The problem is that most people who get into political high office are control freaks, and a portion of those who get into military high office are also control freaks, and when you give them the ability to reach out and control people from a long distance, they really like using it even when they really shouldn't. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope you've had a good week. We have finished 1 episode of the Spanish Armada. There are 3 more videos on the Armada coming up, with the conclusion of the campaign coming up this Wednesday, if you're listening to this Drydock at the time of release, followed up on this coming Friday by a video looking at who exactly stopped the successful implementation of the Armada. Was it England or was it the Netherlands? And then finally, later on this month, again from time of release, we'll be looking at what the sailors on both sides were eating. That'll be the second Friday video of the month. In any case, hope you're looking forward to all that. See you again in another video. Toodles.